Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Charmley. I'm here at the Manse to talk about one of the early volumes, the fourth, in fact, in the series, the Cunningham Lectures. The Cunningham Lectures were founded as a memorial to Principal William Cunningham of New College, Edinburgh, which was then the Free Church College. The first series of Cunningham Lectures, and the Trust basically said there had to be 6 lectures delivered at New College, and they had to be published afterwards. The first series was delivered by Robert Candlish, who succeeded Cunningham at New College as the principal, hence it seems appropriate that he be asked to give the first series. The second is Buchanan on justification, which I've spoken of in another video. And the fourth is this volume, James Walker, The Theology and Theologians of Scotland, 1560 to 1750. Now, some of the early Cunningham lecture series, many of them are by internationally renowned theologians. James Walker was not an internationally renowned anything. This was the only book he ever published in his lifetime, and the only other book published was a volume of literary remains published after his death. He was born in 1821 in the Church of Scotland Manse at Carnwath, in the presbytery of Lanark. He was ordained to the Free Church ministry in the same parish in 1843. He retired due to ill health in 1876, and he died in 1891. He was nevertheless an acknowledged expert in historical theology, particularly Scottish historical theology. And so it was that this parish minister was asked to deliver the fourth series of Cunningham Lectures. As it turned out, his illness meant that he was unable to revise the work for the press afterwards. Most, particularly of the early Cunningham Lectures volumes, have been very heavily revised and worked over by the author. The most notorious of these, or it should be the most notorious, is Principal Salmon's Christian Doctrine of Immortality, which is over 700 pages in length. Now, this is 6 lectures delivered at the Theological College, even allowing for the appetite of the Scottish theological students for this material. 700 pages for 6 lectures, and you look at Walker is about 200 pages. So Salmon massively expands his material. Walker, when it's published, Walker hasn't been able to do anything. He's had some friends who have corrected his manuscripts and sent them off to the press. There was a second edition asked for in 1888. Walker had hoped to be able to revise it, but again his health actually meant that all that could be done was a few corrections and a brand new chapter 4 brought in, which was something he'd written elsewhere. It was reprinted in 1982 by Knox Press, Edinburgh, the publishing house of the Free Church of Scotland, with a foreword by Donald MacLeod. And it is a classic work. Walker was a great writer, a very capable author, and he takes us from John Knox through to the middle of the 18th century, so he doesn't deal with his contemporaries. In this, he's very sensible. It's very difficult for a man to form an accurate impression of contemporary theology. We can go back 50 years perhaps, or in his case go back a little over 100 years, and we can say, yes, we can tell who were the great theologians and who were not. But when you're dealing with living men, then it becomes very difficult to say who are the great men and who are the men who are secondary. Well, as I say, he begins with John Knox, and where better to begin than the great Scottish reformer. This is volume 1 of his work, 6-volume edition. It was reprinted by the Banner of Truth Trust reprinted in 2015. This is the David Lang edition, 2014 reprint, excuse me. This is to do with the 500th anniversary of Knox's birth. We're not entirely sure that that is the correct anniversary, but it's probably closer to than what was celebrated in the 19th century, when people thought that Knox was about 10 years older than he really was. But anyway, back to Walker. Walker opens, "The Theology of Scotland begins with the Reformation, and the first of our great theological writers is John Knox himself. No doubt the Reformer was more a preacher and a man of action than a student and a thinker, yet he was the latter as well as the former. His clear, strong mind firmly grasped the Calvinistic system, with which it might be said he had both morally and intellectually natural affinities, and he was sufficiently acquainted with its scriptural grounds, with its accepted methods of doctrinal statement, even with the metaphysics, to be the expounder and defender of it. Very far from being the mere iconoclast, he was also the great teacher of his countrymen. The first Confession of Faith, the first Book of Discipline, in its magnificent comprehensiveness, one of the most remarkable compositions of a great time, both of them chiefly the work of Knox, the long and elaborate treatise on predestination, in which the doctrines of grace and of the divine sovereignty are so vigorously, yet upon the whole so wisely asserted and maintained, give Knox a high place among theologians, and at any rate they have been greatly influential in giving direction to the theological thinking of our country." And you see this with these volumes. They were reprinted, as I say, to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Knox's birth. And they are not the easiest read, because they are written not in English but in Scots. Now, Scots is a dialect moving on to be a language. It's very similar to English, so that an English reader can understand it. It's not a foreign language, but it is a different tongue, we may say, from English. The greater part, the largest work Knox ever wrote, was his History of the Reformation in Scotland. But he wrote many other works, and again, it's not the easiest read in the world, but it is worth reading. I won't pretend to have read the whole of Knox's works. I have read a good chunk, but John Knox, the great Scottish theologian, he goes on to speak then of later Scottish theologians, Samuel Rutherford being the next that he brings up. And Rutherford was indeed a great man. I shall bring in very briefly a little bit of Rutherford. Using the magic of the pause button, able to bring in Samuel Rutherford. Now, Rutherford is best known for this work, The Letters of Samuel Rutherford. This is the letters in the Andrew Bonner edition. This is the most complete edition. There were early editions, but this is the one that you will find reprinted today by the Banner of Truth Trust. Rutherford is famed as a correspondent. He wrote these letters, many of them from exile in Aberdeen, so that he writes to George Gillespie, another great theologian of the 17th century. Reverend and dear brother, I received your letter. As for my case, brother, I bless his glorious name that my losses are my gain, my prison a palace, and my sadness joyfulness. At my first entry, my apprehensions so wrought upon my cross that I became jealous of the love of Christ as being by him thrust out of the vineyard, and I was under great challenges, as ordinarily melted gold casteth forth a drossy scum, And Satan and our corruptions form the first words that the heavy cross speaketh, and say, God is angry, he loveth you not. But our apprehensions are not canonical. They indite lies of God and Christ's love. But since my spirit was settled, and the clay has fallen to the bottom of the well, I see better what Christ was doing. And now my Lord is returned with salvation under his wings. Now I want little of half a heaven, and I find Christ every day so sweet, comfortable, lovely, and kind, that three things only trouble me. First, I see not how to be thankful, or how to get help to praise that royal King who raiseth up those who are bowed down. Second, his love paineth me and woundeth my soul, so that I am in a fever for want of real presence. Third, an excessive desire to take instruments in God's name, that this is Christ and his truth, which I now suffer for, yea, the apple of the eye of Christ's honour, even the sovereignty and royal privileges of our King and lawgiver Christ. That's a little flavour of dear old Samuel Rutherford. And Walker writes of him, Samuel Rutherford, speaking of the first of the 17th century theologian, Samuel Rutherford, I have put first on this list, and perhaps he is the greatest. To most of us it is likely he is best known by his letters, letters which I may say stand all alone in religious literature. To some as bright with unearthly glory, to others as offending against all sacred proprieties, yet all will admit there is something about them sui generis. Condemn their taste if you will, you cannot but own that they contain flashes of real, if unregulated genius. So far as I know, they are the only letters 2 centuries old which are still a practical reality in the religious life of Scotland, England, and America. And they still retain something of that grasp on people's hearts. Going to the 18th century, he writes of Thomas Boston. Thomas Boston. Boston has his own memoir, The Banner of Truth, was republished, and also his Human Nature in its fourfold state. And another book that I don't have a copy of here in this room, though I do have it somewhere in this house, is his Crook in the Lot. It's a very helpful work, particularly in the present era, when we are dealing with suffering. How do you suffer for Christ? How do you deal with the reality of suffering? And he says, among these 18th century men, I notice first and foremost Thomas Boston, whom I cannot but regard as one of the great figures in our theological history. Brave, honest, capable, forming his own opinions about everything, never letting a question lie by him unsettled, combining with the aspirations or ambitions of a strong and active intellect a sense of responsibility which pressed him to work with his might, in spite of the most unfavourable circumstances, and they are told in the memoirs. He won his way to theological eminence and left his mark on the theology and the religion of his country. Now, Walker arranges his work largely in terms of topics. The opening chapter, the first 35 pages, is a survey of the field which goes over the men in their periods. But he then deals in chapter 2 with predestination and providence. Scottish theology is overwhelmingly Calvinistic historically, and of course there have been controversies over Arminianism and Calvinism in Scotland. The third chapter deals with the atonement. The fourth, which is the one that was added in for the second edition, the doctrine of the visible church. The Scottish theologians he's dealing with are predominantly Presbyterian. In fact, they are overwhelmingly Presbyterian. And for the Presbyterians, the question of the visible church as an organisation is very important. Chapter 5, the headship of Christ and Erastianism, that's the relationship of church and state. And of course it was that debate that led to the Great Disruption and the formation of the Free Church of Scotland. And the final chapter is, well, the penultimate chapter rather, is on present misrepresentations of Scottish religion. And finally, do Presbyterians hold apostolical succession? That was a question. Not only had it been raised by the Oxford movement in England, but there were within the Church of Scotland at the time men who had raised the idea of apostolic succession. The so-called Scoto-Catholic party was arising. We may think it very strange to think of Presbyterian men embracing some sort of apostolic succession doctrine, but it happened. It happened. Well, I could read many more extracts, but I'll just read one about the Marrow controversy. This is one that Thomas Boston was involved in. It really revolves around a Puritan book, a 17th century book, called The Marrow of Modern Divinity. Well, if there was a book today called the Marrow, the Essence of Modern Divinity, Modern Theology, we should throw it out of the window, because it would be the marrow of modernist theology. But of course, a marrow of Puritan theology. And this dealt very much with questions involving the law and the atonement. So again, in the Marrow controversy, and a lot of this book is to do with controversies, because it's in controversy that the church is led to ask, well, what actually do we believe, and why do we believe it? Again, in the Marrow controversy, the church was agitated about the extent of redemption. Boston, when he was minister of Simpryn, in visiting among his flock, fell in with a volume in the house of one of his members, the title of which interested him. He took it home with him. Eager at the time for books, he was soon busy with its perusal, and that perusal was, you might say, both an epoch in his life and in the religious history of Scotland. That book was The Marrow of Modern Divinity. And The Marrow of Modern Divinity was, in course of time, issued afresh from the Scottish press. Soon the country was ablaze with theological discussion. Boston's edition, which is the one most often reprinted today, has a number of footnotes to deal with some misapprehensions that arose in its initial reading. The Marrow was condemned by the General Assembly as teaching several erroneous doctrines, which it didn't. It's just that it was possible to misunderstand it as teaching that, and among others that of universal redemption as to purchase. That same charge was made and continued to be made against the supporters of the Marrow. The ground of the accusation was their holding that it is part of the direct act of faith to believe that Christ died for me, and that what he did and suffered, he did and suffered for me. This, it was asserted by Principal Haddo and other writers, evidently capable men, could mean nothing else than that Christ had died for every man, that it was in fact a part of saving faith to believe in that. The Marrow men denied the charge indignantly. In truth, they were extreme particular redemptionists. This is the irony, that the Marrow men are Calvinists, and they are very definite and decided Calvinists, and so they are outraged to be charged with teaching what amounts to Arminianism. And so he goes on through these various debates, discussions. I'll just read a final extract from the beginning of chapter 6. It is not an uncommon allegation that Scotch religion is harsh, austere, gloomy, a stern and frowning thing, revelling in the dark, dread mysteries of a stern theology. Well, sometimes it is not very easy to know what is meant by the allegation. If it is meant the doctrines of man's fallen and guilty state, of the reality and punishment of sin, of regeneration, of vicarious atonement, doctrines which Scottish theology has always taught and are of the sort alluded to, then of course I have meant to answer that these doctrines are no peculiar heritage of our country. They have a place in every creed in Christendom. They were the belief of Luther and Cranmer, of Hooker and Baxter. Even in its doctrine of the sovereign electing grace of God, the Church of Scotland only treads in the footsteps of the greatest of the fathers, whom all Western Christendom venerates, of course, is Augustine. I'm back again with that point that all of Western theology is a series of debates about the work of Augustine of Hippo. But this is the Theology and Theologians of Scotland. It's an excellent work. It's a brief work, well written, and well worth reading to grasp something of how theology has come about. There are, of course, books that deal with historical theology on a broader scale. One of them is Cunningham's, which is based upon his lectures at New College. There are more modern works, but this deals with one aspect of historical theology in one corner of God's great vineyard. Well, thank you for watching. May God bless you and keep you. May God help you indeed in the study of the best books and of the best book of all, His own Word.